Aggregate planning in a supply chain. The learning objectives of this module are to understand the concept of aggregate planning, to analyze the role of aggregate planning in supply chain, to understand the information needed for aggregate planning process, to learn the various strategies in aggregate planning, to understand the different methods of aggregate planning process, to formulate and solve a basic aggregate planning problem using an example. The learning outcomes are an understanding of aggregate planning and its role in supply chain. We should have learned the various strategies in aggregate planning and the methods of solving an aggregate planning problem. Let us have an introduction to supply chain. Supply chain involves in moving materials from the supplier point to the customer point through the intermediaries in a cost-effective manner to satisfy the customer. In this process, we can visualize information flow, fund flow, and material flow across the supply chain in both directions. The primary objective of the supply chain is to satisfy the customer needs and generate profit. Supply chain management is the set of activities involved in efficiently integrating the suppliers, manufacturers, warehouses, and stores so that the products which are produced are distributed at the right quantities to the right location and at the right time in order to minimize the system-wide cost while satisfying the service level requirements of each member in the supply chain to meet the customer expectations. Let us now understand what aggregate planning is. Aggregate planning is the process of planning the quantity and timing of output over an intermediate time horizon, say 6 to 12 months period in a manufacturing plant. It involves adjusting the controllable variables to respond to forecast and order fluctuations in a rational manner. What should be the capacity of a plant to meet the fluctuating demand? Should the company decide the capacity based on this demand or plan for average demand and satisfy the demand using other resources like subcontracting or inventory holding? These questions arise to a manufacturing plant. Holding inventory during less demand period and using the accumulated stock during the peak period demand will be an option. Allowing stock out and making the customer to wait till the next period and then satisfying his demand may be another option. Aggregate planning analyzes this situation and determines the quantity required in terms of capacity of the plant, production, subcontracting, inventory, and stockouts in meeting the demand of the supply chain. The basic objective of the aggregate planning is to satisfy the demand at the lowest cost and maximize the profit of the manufacturing company. Let us now discuss on the role of aggregate planning in supply chain. Aggregate planning is the planning process followed in a manufacturing company in a supply chain to satisfy the fluctuating demand. The company uses the controllable variables of production process, capacity, workforce, inventory, subcontracting, back ordering to cater to the demand. Since the process of aggregate planning is associated with manufacturing plant, will this impact the supply chain? Yes, it will have an impact on the supply chain. The downstream and upstream partners of the supply chain are going to have an impact because of the collaborative forecast where they do in determining the demand for the supply chain to increase its efficiency. The demand of the downstream members of the supply chain determines the forecast of the production plan. The production plan of a manufacturing company will define the demand of the supplier of the supply chain. Hence, the aggregate plan of a manufacturing company in the supply chain impacts the entire supply chain processes. The controllable variables which are used in aggregate planning are capacity, workforce, time, inventory, subcontracting, back ordering. The aggregate plan is prepared using the various variables, allowing the supply chain to alter the capacity allocation, supply contracts, inventory stock, inventory moved, labor employed, etc. to satisfy the demand of the supply chain. This plan, which is done by the manufacturer, should be shared with the members of the supply chain, suppliers, transporters, warehouse and the retailers, to incorporate the changes needed in their plans, which will optimize the supply chain performance. Hence, coordination of the members of the supply chain becomes important. Lack of coordination among the members will lead to shortages or oversupply in the supply chain, resulting in the inefficiency of the supply chain. Therefore, we understand that an aggregate plan plays a very important role across the supply chain. What are the informations which are needed for an aggregate plan? An aggregate plan is prepared to satisfy the fluctuating demand using the controllable variables over an intermediate time period. So, to prepare the plan, the following information are needed: demand forecast for the time period, details about the production costs like regular time production cost, overtime production cost, hiring cost, layoff cost of the laborers, machine hours required for production, inventory carrying cost, stock out cost or back ordering cost, constraints on the controllable variables if any, then limitations on inventory, safety stock, workforce, overtime, stock outs, supply contracts, capital constraints, etc. should be known when we do the process of aggregate production planning. In this episode, we have discussed the role of aggregate production planning in supply chain and understanding of what aggregate production planning are. In the next episode, we will discuss about the aggregate planning strategies. Thank you.